Hi Nat5, so we are looking at the reproduction key area in the multicellular unit. So in this topic what we're really looking at is the differences between the types of gametes, that's the sex cells that are produced for sexual reproduction, and how they have to be structured the way they are and how that impacts on their genetics. Okay, so just to be clear in our definitions, reproduction is the process that produces new individuals. We've got two parents if it's sexual reproduction. If it's not two parents, if it's one, then it's asexual reproduction, and that would produce clones. What's really important about sexual reproduction is that you get variation, and there was a lot of conversation about that in the key areas for life on Earth about evolution. So from key area 1, this is the first place that we had chromosome complement mentioned. Just a reminder, most of your cells are diploid. That means that you have 2 copies of every chromosome. But for make the next generation, which also needs to be diploid, so therefore needs 2 sets of chromosomes, each parent can only give 1 set. That 1 set is a haploid cell. Okay, and that was done in key area 1, but you need to have these terms, diploid and haploid. So the particular cells that are these haploid cells are gametes. Gamete is the general term for a sex cell. So that's a cell that is going to be used to pass on genetic information in reproduction. So it's a haploid cell with half the information that you need to make that new individual. The type of structure of the gamete is really quite drastically different as to whether it's a female or male gamete. Really depends on where it has to travel and how much energy it's then going to need to do that. You need to know plant and animal gametes, so starting with the plants. Okay, the male plant gamete is pollen. I'm assuming we have heard of pollen. Some of you might really hate it because you get hay fever. Okay, but pollen comes in lots and lots of different shapes and sizes. And all of these shapes and sizes are to do with it travelling from one plant to another plant. So if it's, say, something that's moved by the wind, it's going to be as small as it possibly can be, so it's light, and it's going to probably be smooth. Whereas if it's something that gets picked up by, say, a bee, then it wants to be spiky or sticky so that it can be attached to it. And inside the actual pollen grain, you've got the pollen nucleus, and that nucleus is the haploid nucleus that you need for the reproduction. And they are very small. This is obviously under a microscope, and you will make a lot of them. Okay, which is really why this is called the male gamete in plants, because that's how we see it because of what we do. The female plant gamete is the ovule. Okay, so the ovule is found inside the ovary inside the plant. And basically that's the bit that you're going to use to make the seed. So the ovule is actually, you can see it with the naked eye, it's quite a large structure, certainly compared to the pollen. Okay, so you get a lot of food inside there because that's the one that's going to become the seed. And it doesn't move from the flower, so it doesn't need to be small, it doesn't need to be sticky, it doesn't need to have ways to catch the wind, anything like that, it just sits there. So we don't make very many compared to pollen, because if you're making something bigger, it costs more to make it, and by that I mean cost in terms of energy. So you can maybe make 1 ovule to 1 million pollen grains. So that's what they would do. Okay. In animals, so the male gamete is the sperm. So in a similar way to the plant one, what we're talking about here is something that needs to move. So in the sperm's case, it's a tail, okay, it's because it needs to swim. It has a whole pile of mitochondria packed in here just at the base of the head of the sperm, and that's because it needs to have a huge amount of energy because it needs to move. So this will produce a lot of energy for the tail. Okay, and then we've got the nucleus up here at the head, and that's obviously containing the haploid information that you need for reproduction. Very small, so because it's very small, you can afford to make a lot of them. The female gamete is the egg in animals. It has to be really large because it has to develop into the embryo, and it has, once it's actually got to a certain point, certainly in us, because we're placental mammals, it will attach on to the side of the uterus and it will be fed by mum. But up until that point, it has to contain everything it needs to survive and divide. So it has to be packed up with a huge amount of energy. And that means that it's an expensive thing to make. So you're not going to make very many of them. And also, you need to only allow one sperm to enter the cell. You can't have extra sets of chromosomes, not and have the cell survive. So just to give an idea of your actual size difference, this is the sperm cell at 30 micrometers cubed, and here's your egg cell, substantially larger. So because of that difference in size, there is a difference in energy cost. You can see why you're only making a few egg cells, whereas you can make a huge number of sperm cells. So where they actually look like on a plant, okay, you need to be able to find the anther, which is where you produce the pollen, and you need to be able to find reasonably the filament, which holds the anther up. Put these together, it's called the stamen, which men for male parts. Okay, you then have something called the stigma, mom, female part, where the pollen lands, and then when the pollen lands on this, drops down a little tube with the nucleus inside, which then joins up with the ovule inside the ovary. This whole section here is the ovary. So what will happen is this little ovule here will develop into a seed, and this whole section here will develop into the fruit. So you only need to know a few parts of the reproductive system. Okay, looking at the reproductive system in humans, you need to know that the ovary produces the egg cells. Okay, so you've got two ovaries, one on either side here. And you need to know that you have the oviduct up here. So that's the tube that kind of connects from the ovary down into the uterus here. And you need to know that fertilization occurs up there. So this is where the egg cell has to meet the sperm to get a successful fertilization in terms of pregnancy. If it's further down, so if it's actually moved down to here, then that won't actually have enough time to divide and therefore attach on and develop. Okay, this is obviously the uterus, and that's where the embryo develops. So these are the three things that you need to know about the female reproductive system. The male reproductive system, the only thing that you're expected to know for this is that the sperm are produced in the testes, and that's it. So fertilization, being absolutely clear about what this is. So in plants, we have the pollen grows a little tube down and then drops down the nucleus. In animals, the sperm has to swim to the egg and then has to fuse with the egg. But what fertilization is when the two nuclei, the sperm and the egg, or the pollen and the ovule, nuclei fuse to form a fertilized egg or ovule. Okay, that's fertilization, the point at which the two nuclei fuse. And the type of cell you now have in animals is called a zygote, and that's the specific term you need to know. Okay, so after fertilization we have our diploid zygote, and that zygote can then just start dividing, and it's going to just do normal cell division. It's just mitosis. So that then keeps dividing and dividing and dividing, and we end up with a bundle of cells, which is our embryo. Okay, and the embryo will then continue to divide, develop, until you finally have a full organism.